Good evening, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Happy New Year. As we start 2022, with everything crossed that this will be the year that we can finally get back to visiting our battlefields again. I say that, I did manage to get to quite a few battlefields between September and November of last year, but let's start again for another year. And one of the people that I would like to be visiting at some stage is the old stomping ground of this chap we're going to speak about tonight, Eric Gascoigne, Kipper Robinson. Now, I should start by saying that my interest and my passion for studying the Great War really has lasted for 40 years plus now. And throughout that period, there are three real chapters of the conflict in particular that I return to time and time again. And they remain the Gallipoli Campaign, Palestine, and the Zeebrugge Raid. For me personally, these three elements of the First World War have always kind of cut through the industrial destruction that we see on the Western Front. It's almost as if they act like infrequent splashes of colour on what can be a largely dark canvas. So they continue to catch my eye. Our subject tonight, Eric, actually features in all three of those. Now, I've written quite a few papers recently for conferences or seminars, and spoken in person at a few as well. And these have focused largely on the operational aspects of the war. They've been delivered in quite an academic fashion, setting out questions and featuring learning points and offering conclusions. Yet tonight's subject, Eric, reads far more like a boy's own story. It's one that would not have been out of place on the cover of Victor comic that I've displayed there. And for anyone of my age, 53, I am a youngster still, this really was primary source material when I was growing up. Throughout my studies of the Great War, I often find the subjects dramatic, overwhelming, uplifting, tragic, heroic, and also a tremendously humbling experience. It's without doubt, although he only occupies a footnote in the official history of the Great War, the life of Eric Gascoigne, Kipper Robinson, that we're going to hear about tonight, is all of those things. He lived, loved, and lost throughout what was quite a fascinating period of our long history. And so this really is Eric's story. Eric's life begins, much like my own, in the riverside borough of Greenwich. Being of southeast London roots, I've grown up knowing the area very well. Greenwich hugs that southern bend there of old Father Thames that you can see. It's neighboured by heavy industry and packed upon packed rows of housing that were really built for a community where life was virtually dependent on the river. Yet at its heart, Greenwich has Christopher Wren's stunning Naval College that will lead you up to the Royal Observatory there, the walled gardens of Greenwich Park, and the picture postcard village of Blackheath, all of which soften, brighten, and somewhat smarten up the landscape. And for any of you that would have seen the fireworks this year, midnight from London, you would have seen the backdrop of Greenwich Naval College as they were being sent up into the sky. Now, flanking the walls of Greenwich Park and ringed there, I've put in that sort of that ringed circle. This is certainly an older map, it's a lot more built up now. You find a number of smart Georgian houses that once belonged to naval officers and sea captains. And these really do provide what is a smart respectability to the area. I have to say they're far removed from the estates and the tower blocks that provided housing for my own family since they first settled on Deptford Creek in the 1720s to work in the shipbuilding industry. It was in one of these splendid streets that Eric really entered the world. Diamond Terrace, you can see it there on the right, is within sight of the Ranger's house and is actually slap bang on the Meridian line. No doubt, however, Eric's childhood, like my own, would have involved walking through Greenwich Park so that you could see those unbroken views of our capital from the statue of General Wolfe. You could watch the red ball drop from Flamstead House at 1 o'clock every day. And you can wonder as a child at the fact that Greenwich can really claim to be the place where modern time and navigation actually begins. The real reason that Eric grew up here was his father. It's the Reverend John Lovell Robinson. You can see him there sporting a rather fashionable today beard at the bottom of the screen. He was born in County Cork in 1849. He'd studied theology at Trinity College, Dublin, up to master's level, and he was actually appointed as an instructor to the Royal Navy in 1871. Initially, he was part of the Channel Squadron, but was soon promoted and posted as chaplain and naval instructor to HMS Rover, which is the ship you can see on the top right. This was in 1875, and this ship was rather exotically stationed in North America and the West Indies. It was in 1879 that he actually took up a posting at the Naval College in Greenwich, and here he taught acting sub-lieutenants in mathematics. It was during this time as an instructor at Greenwich that he was actually published twice. He wrote mainly on technical matters that were quite useful to young officers studying for the course. In fact, one of his books there, The Elements of Marine Surveying of 1888, still remains in print today. One of his young students during this period was actually George V. Eric's father, however, was not the only military influence on his life. His maternal grandfather, John Hawkins Gascoigne, was from nearby Charlton. He had been a major general in the Royal Marines. He'd seen active service in the Crimea and in China, and he was an accomplished watercolor artist, including the view you can see there at the top, which was one of his own paintings of the Halifax harbour. And it was from this grandfather that Eric actually took his middle name of Gascoigne. Now, it's often been debated where the nickname Kipper came from for Eric. Some people suggest that it comes from significant or continual smoking, though the actual origins are quite unclear. We do know that some of his school friends actually refer to him as Kipper in correspondence with his family. The school he went to was St John's School that you see there in the middle. This was situated in Leatherhead in Surrey, and it was established as an educational facility for the sons of poor clergymen. By the time Eric arrived here in the 1890s, this was far from the case, however, and the school actually provided numerous national sportsmen of distinction, notably rugby players and cricketers. Eric himself excelled at hockey during this time. Two characters of note that would have been at school around the same time as Eric, I'd like to mention. Firstly, the chap on the left there, who's Geoffrey Woolley. He was serving with the 9th Londons, the Queen Victoria Rifles, when he became the first territorial officer to be awarded the Victoria Cross at Hill 60 in the April of 1915. The chap on the right is probably lesser known to many of you. This is Paymaster Joseph Gedge. Now, Joseph Gedge actually became the first British officer to die in World War I when his ship, the HMS Amphion, was sunk after striking a mine on the 6th of August, 1914. This was shortly after she had pursued and sunk the German mine layer, the SS Königin Louise. And in fact, the Gedge Medal is still awarded today for professional merit in the accountants branch of the Royal Navy. After he left school in 1897, Eric actually joined HMS Britannia. This was an officer training establishment close to Dartmouth. The Britannia was in fact a historic wooden-hulled vessel. Previously, it had been the 131-gun HMS Prince of Wales. She'd been converted into a floating college alongside the similarly aged HMS Hindustan that provided occupation. And what we have here, accommodation. What we have here is both a painting and also a photograph of these vessels to give you some idea. During this period of training, young officer cadets would have gone through a real shock to their system. Alongside the practical skills that sea cadets were required to learn at this time, fitness, discipline were cornerstones of the day. Reveille was 0630 sharp, and this was followed by a dip in the what could have been rather icy River Dart before physical training lessons and various inspections. They played quite a lot of hockey, of course, a sport that Eric would have excelled at, and now that's something that would offer him welcome relief from the other physical exertion. Another memorable occasion in his first year of service would have been the 1897 Spithead Naval Review, and this was obviously to commemorate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. The Royal Navy was by now the dominant global maritime power. And the combined force of some 165 ships that were present at the review, then the greatest armada the world had ever seen, was crewed by some 38,000 personnel. Just think about that, just for that review, 38,000 seamen present. This would have been quite awe-inspiring sight for the young cadets who were training close by. Perhaps the most notable event of the day was what's often referred to as the Turbinia incident. Seen on the blurry image you can see on the bottom right, which is an actual still from 1897, Charles Parson decided to, the inventor Charles Parson, decided to launch a publicity stunt to demonstrate his new, rather revolutionary steam turbine engine. Just as the review was starting and the bands were striking up, this small craft, the Turbinia, arrived amongst the fleet and at an outstanding speed raced in amongst the main vessels. This not only caused panic, but also quite a considerable security concern. Picket boats were soon dispatched, but they just could not catch the vessel. So fast was the Turbinia compared to the traditional reciprocating engines. Within a decade of this incident, the Royal Navy had almost entirely adopted Charles Parsons steam turbines for the new Dreadnought class. It was here that Eric Robinson had witnessed rather a significant moment in naval history. It's fair to say that this would not be the last time this happened. The following year, in 1898, Midshipman Robinson, as he was known then, joined HMS Majestic. This was a relatively new first-class battleship, was armed with four 12-inch guns and 10 6-inch guns. She was the flagship of the Channel Fleet and the largest pre-dreadnought when she was launched in 1895. She was under the command of Sir Vice Admiral Sir Harry Rawson, who was quite a strict disciplinarian. Eric Robinson would have learnt hard and fast the ways of how to behave as a young naval officer under his command. I really wanted to involve Rawson in this, just for the benefit of trivia, if this ever comes up in one of the online quizzes you no doubt take part in. But if it does, Rawson would later be the commanding officer in the Anglo-Zanzibar War. Now, what makes that particular conflict fascinating is that it still today remains the shortest war in history, lasting just 38 minutes on the 27th of August, 1896. Though Eric Robinson's time on the Majestic was brief, he would actually be reacquainted with her in 1915 throughout the Dardanelles Campaign. At Gallipoli, the Majestic would be heavily engaged not only in the preliminary bombardment on the inner forts in late February, where she was hit 4 times during an attempt to force the Narrows on the 18th of March 1915. She was the vessel that signalled to London that the landings had actually taken place on the 25th of April. And as you can see from the right-hand picture there, she met an untimely end on the 27th of May when she was struck by a torpedo fired by the U-21. She actually sank within 9 minutes and a loss of 49 men. And she still lays at a shallow depth today. In fact, it's just being converted into a sort of a scuba diving museum that the Turkish authorities are going to be opening up in the next few years. If we return back to Eric Robinson, however, he was just 17 when he sailed eastwards on his new ship, the HMS Endymion. This was for China in June 1899 and arrived just in time for the Boxer Rebellion. Now, the Endymion was an armoured cruiser equipped with 9.2-inch and 6-inch guns. She also had 4 18-inch torpedo tubes, a weapon system that Eric would excel at later in his career. The Boxer Rebellion is a rather complex conflict that's rooted in long simmering tension, not only over Britain and other foreign powers' colonial influences in the area, but also alongside a rather cultural clash between Christian missionaries that conflicted with the traditional Chinese beliefs. The tension came to a head somewhat with a series of riots in German-controlled China. These were rapidly quashed, and what followed were extremely hard reprisals by the Germans at this stage, including the shooting of a number of peasants and the burning down of villages. What this led to was a nationalist movement growing out of the unrest that were actually named the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. And these were the people that were known to the Westerners as the Boxers. As attacks on Western missionaries increased, the pro-Western Empress Sisi, who you see there on the left of the screen, actually outlawed the Boxers as a group. The West, however, still demanded harsher treatment and threatened China with military force. Now, initially, Sisi resisted any approaches from the Boxers to support her, but realizing that her own forces were no match for any foreign power, she accepted what could only be rather poor advice to allow the Boxers to come under imperial control and actually oppose the multinational force that was now gathering in the region. Quickly, any perceived authority Sisi had over the Boxers diminished. By the spring of 1900, thousands of Boxers roamed around the streets of Beijing, calling for the death to any foreigners. The embassies of the Western nations were soon sieged, and fearing that bloodletting would lead to rather a catastrophic response from the West, Sisi allowed a small force under Admiral Seymour to travel from Tenzin to Beijing to protect the various diplomatic groups and the embassies. The group size that Sisi permitted was actually 400. In fact, 2,000 sailors and Marines landed, and among those 2,000 was the newly arrived Eric Robinson. It's fair to say the train journey was not straightforward, as you can see here. Sabotage and attack occurred every few miles, and what started as a relief force to assist Chinese officials quickly became a war against Imperial China. As the train actually approached Beijing, it was attacked by a sizable force of Chinese regular troops. The occupants formed a defensive position along the tracks, as you see in the image on the left there. And it was at this time that in a letter home, Kipper Robinson described hearing the bullets hissing overhead as both sides entered a firefight. Once the Marines had the upper hand in this firefight, a counterattack was pressed through a series of charges, only stopping to fire a volley into what were now retiring Chinese ranks. And it was during this time that Kipper received a slight wound to his arm, and a round passed through his Wolseley service helmet. The route back to Tenzin was now cut, and reinforcements were fairly unrealistic. On the 21st of June, Sisi formally declared war on all foreign powers, including Kipper's group, who were now sieged outside of Beijing. Admiral Seymour, in charge of the force, decided now that the best course of action was to abandon the trains and fight their way back on foot to Tenzin by following the Hai River. They were harassed each day by both Boxer forces and also regular Chinese forces. The fight in retirement came to a head somewhat as the column passed through the Imperial Army arsenal at a place called Siku. Initially, the foreign forces were offered or promised safe passage past on their way to retreat. The group was soon fired upon, however, and a desperate battle ensued before Seymour's men managed to capture some Chinese guns and turn them onto the enemy. The Marines then outflanked the hesitant Chinese force and enabled Seymour to occupy the arsenal. Now, once he was inside, this position of the arsenal itself was quite a defensive gift, and despite being heavily outnumbered, any subsequent counterattacks were beaten off. Eventually, a Cossack-led relief force arrived on the 25th of June to break the siege. Once safely back at Tenzin, the multinational force then regrouped itself, and it now contained Russian, Japanese, British, French, and US forces, a real coalition group. The Empress Sisi now found ourselves in the unenviable position of resisting foreign intervention occupation, while at the same time fearing and not trusting her own forces, specifically the Boxers. On the 4th of August 1900, as part of a 20,000 strong force, Eric Robinson marched on the Central Armory at Pei Sang, and after a short engagement, the Chinese broke and retired. It was during this retirement that Eric was wounded once again for the second time, this time in the upper arm. This decision, however, this decisive victory, however, effectively ended the Chinese resistance, by the 14th of August, Beijing was relieved and the war was over. With the situation now stabilized somewhat, Kipper remained in the region for a couple of years, patrolling the Yangtze River in a gunboat, and by 1903 had been promoted to a lieutenant. By 1905, he returned to the UK and underwent torpedo training at Portchester. Whilst home, he married Edith, was promoted to lieutenant commander, and settled down to a fairly pleasant life at this stage, having no less than 3 children. In August 1914, however, this was all due to change with the declaration of war. Now, it's fair to say that 1914 was a rather frustrating year for Eric. Initially, he was serving on HMS Amethyst as part of the 7th Cruiser Squadron patrolling the North Sea. His real problems were with his commander, chap you can see there in that wonderful sketch, future Admiral of the Fleet himself, Reginald Tyrwhitt, who did not see eye to eye with Eric. It was in fact welcome news indeed when his commander transferred his flagship to the rather faster Arethusa. This decision, however, led to Eric and his slower Amethyst missing out on the first significant naval battle of the war, that at Heligoland Bight. For the sinking of 6 German ships, Eric was a mere observer, and he later wrote of the battle that war is horrible, but I wished I had not missed it. His opportunity to play a more hands-on role in the war came in late September 1914, when he transferred as torpedo officer to the ship you see here, HMS Vengeance. Now, this was an 1899 pre-dreadnought battleship of the Canopus class. It was actually built for service in Asia, lightly armoured, but with far more efficient Krupp steel. She had a main armament of 12-inch guns backed up by 6-inch guns, numerous quick-firing guns for her own protection, and of course 4 torpedo tubes. Not being a dreadnought and not serving in the Grand Fleet, this may have felt a bit like a sideways move. Instead, however, without Eric realising it at the time, this posting provided not only his potential survival, but also a platform to thrive. I say that because just a day after he was posted, on the 22nd of August 1914, disaster struck his colleagues in the 7th Battle Squadron. Now, these have been nicknamed the Live Bait Squadron by Winston Churchill due to their role to encourage the German fleet out into battle. Instead, however, what they did show was the Navy's vulnerability to submarine attack. Within just over an hour, 3 ships, HMS Hogue, HMS Cressy, and HMS Aboukir were sunk with the combined loss of 1,459 lives. Quite incredible, really. Nearly all of those who were lost are commemorated on the vast Chatham Memorial. It was just weeks later, whilst Kipper was on his way to Suez to join his new ship, there was further bad news received. His older brother Ernest, who had been a merchant seaman with P&O pre-war, but was a member of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, was on board HMS Hawke when she too was torpedoed off the Scottish coast on the 15th of October 1914. Once again, it was the submarine U-9, the same ship that had sunk Hogue, Cressy and Aboukir, that struck. One of the few survivors of this sinking recalled, "We were struck right amidships between the 2 funnels, quite close to one of the magazines. All hands were on deck, and it was a terrible explosion. The vessel immediately took a heavy list to starboard. I've never been on a ship so well equipped with life-saving apparatus, but the way the vessel heeled over made it almost impossible to get our boats out. The boat in which I was saved had a narrow escape from being taken down with the suction. We were struck about 11 o'clock in the forenoon, and just as we got away from the Hawke, we distinctly saw the periscope of the enemy's submarine come to the surface. We thought he was going to ram us, but apparently he was on the lookout for any other rescuing vessels. Prior to the accident, the Hawke was cruising about in zigzag fashion, and we never saw the submarine until we felt her. It was beginning to get hazy when we were almost run down by the Norwegian steamer which had picked us up. This boat, after effecting the rescue, cruised about in search of rafts, but nothing was seen." Just incidentally, HMS Hawke, as you can see on the right there, had already found infamy when she collided with the White Star liner, the Olympic, back in 1911, though a court of inquiry did clear Hawke of any blame. For Kipper, though, with the loss of his brother, this war had suddenly got very personal. In January 1915, the Vengeance and Kipper left Suez, bound for the Dardanelles. Here would be reunited with an old pal of his, Roger Keyes. The pair had not only served together at the Boxer Rebellion, but they'd also, pre-war, been together when Keyes had commanded the submarine force at Harwich. Kipper's knowledge of explosives gained during this torpedo training in HMS Vernon, and his obvious coolness under fire made him stand out somewhat to Keyes, and he was the ideal man for what was supposedly a very dangerous task that was ahead. To allow the naval force to enter and pass through the Dardanelles, minesweepers first had to clear the straits. In turn, however, these minesweepers were subjected to fire from fixed and mobile shore forts. In short, the Navy could not capture the forts without clearing the mines, and the minesweepers couldn't clear the mines because they were fired on by the forts. The solution, with no land forces available, was for Keyes to arrange for naval parties of sailors and marines that would land themselves and attempt to destroy the guns. It was in this that Roger Keyes had no hesitation at all in selecting Kipper Robinson to lead one of those raiding parties. Now, the site chosen here, and you'll see it, was on the Asian side at the entrance to the Dardanelles itself. This was in the shadow of the ancient ruins of Troy, and close to Kum Kale, which is where the French would actually land several weeks later. Now, on the morning of the 26th of February 1915, a small party led by Kipper Robinson was landed just to the north of the position marked Fort Number 4, if you can see my arrow, round about here, this location here. They began to head south down the coast towards a battery that had been identified by HMS Vengeance further out to sea. Before long, they came under fire, and in fact, Sergeant Turnbull became the first land casualty of the Gallipoli Campaign during this incident. Naval gunfire support was fired at a local village and destroyed several windmills, but still small arms fire came in on the raiding party from numerous directions. Now, Robinson, despite the fact that he was wearing a conspicuous naval white uniform along with the rest of his party, continued towards this position we see here from the ground you see on the right. And I took this photograph in 2019 when I was last out in Gallipoli. You can see the strip of land where Robinson landed, and he made his way directly across these fields up onto this rocky outcrop we see here. The rocky outcrop itself is actually an ancient burial ground. It's reputed to be the burial place of the Greek hero Achilles. And it was also believed to be the fire base for a number of the Turkish guns. As Robinson neared the slope, he went forward himself, telling his men to wait for him because they were under fire, and armed with a bag of explosive and a pack of fuses, in full sight of both the naval observers and the Turkish defenders, he actually located a 75mm gun, which he alone destroyed. He then went forward and onwards with his party towards Ornay Fort, Fort Number 4, as it was on the map. This had been abandoned the night before. Here, a 240mm fortress gun was destroyed before he returned with his party under fire to their awaiting boats, and they got away, once again supported by naval gunfire from HMS Vengeance. One witness described the action of Robinson strolling around under heavy fire, rifle fire, like a sparrow enjoying a bath from a garden hose. And of course, you can visit that fort today. Now, for this action, and also his participation in something we're about to discuss shortly, he would be awarded the Victoria Cross. And there he is on the left of the screen. The citation reads, Lieutenant Commander Robinson, on the 26th of February, advanced alone under heavy fire into an enemy's gun position, which might well have been occupied, and destroying a 4-inch gun, returned to his party for another charge, which the second gun was destroyed. Lieutenant Commander Robinson would not allow members of his demolition party to accompany him as their white uniforms rendered them very conspicuous. Lieutenant Commander Robinson took part in 4 attacks on the minefields, always under heavy fire. Now, within a few weeks, on the 13th and 14th of March 1915, Kipper was at it once again. This time, he commanded a trawler manned by volunteers of HMS Vengeance to sweep the minefields at the entrance to the Dardanelles. And there you can see rather ramshackle crew that he had together for this purpose. They were soon spotted by searchlights and fire ripped into the small craft. Despite his own trawler being hit no less than 84 times, he 3 times sailed into the beaten zone to clear a path through the mines. Despite this incredible bravery, it was absolutely to no avail. The decision was taken shortly after this to attempt to force the Dardanelles by de Robeck. This was planned for the 18th of March, a plan itself, as we know, would ultimately fail. Now, where ships failed, submarines could penetrate the Narrows. And here we are back to my old stomping ground there, the Victor comic again. Norman Holbrook had been the first to achieve this in December 1914, when crewing the B-11, he sunk the Masudi and was awarded a Victoria Cross himself. But by now, in April 1915, the new E-class submarines were in theatre. And on the 17th of April, Lieutenant Commander Brodie attempted to break into the Sierra Marmara in the new E-15. Strong currents actually forced her to run aground close to Fort Dardanelles. And here she quickly came under fire. Brodie and 6 of his men were killed, and he's actually buried in the Consular Cemetery in Çanakkale today, before the remainder were taken prisoner. And you can see those there, a lovely website run by a Turkish pal of mine that has got an image of the crew having been taken prisoner by the Ottomans. It now became rather imperative for the naval force in the Dardanelles that the beached E-15 was destroyed before it fell into Turkish hands itself. Remember, this was cutting edge of submarine technology at the time. The way they went to rescue this was in a number of steam-powered picket boats from HMS Triumph and HMS Majestic. Each of these were fitted with torpedoes, and despite their slow speed, their rather shallow draft would enable them to drift in fairly close to the E-15 before they would launch their weapons to try and sink the stricken vessel. Lieutenant Goodwin commanded one boat, while Eric Robinson, the second one from HMS Triumph, and in a craft exactly like this one, they set off just before midnight. Now, once again, searchlights spotted them early and blinded the 2 commanders. Despite coming under heavy fire for over an hour, Robinson continued to creep slowly and gingerly towards the E-15. Struggling to find his target, he fired his torpedo blindly and somewhat missed. Goodwin had rather better luck, however, and fired shortly afterwards, striking the conning tower of the E-15. As both pickets turned for home, Goodwin's vessel was hit and began to sink. Without any hesitation, Eric Robinson, despite the dangers to himself, turned his picket about and under heavy fire returned to rescue his stricken comrades. Now, the Times actually reported this incident as a brilliant naval enterprise. The Turks have been foiled. The country will read with pride and admiration the story of the brilliant exploit of the volunteer crews of the picket boats of the Triumph and the Majestic. This very satisfactory piece of work rivals in daring and audacity the finest cutting-out achievements of the old seaman. No incident of the war better illustrates the living presence in the fleet today of the spirit and the tradition of the old Navy. There's a wonderful bit of propaganda for you. What we actually see here is the E-15. You can see the hole in the conning tower that was caused by Goodwin, but of course the vessel was eventually reclaimed by the Ottomans itself. It wasn't only the British, however, that marvelled at the bravery. Ernest Rochman, a German diver, was attempting to salvage the vessel when it came under attack, and he wrote in his memoirs, "I've never in the course of the war seen an attack carried out with such pluck and such fearlessness." Roger Keyes, you can see there on the right, rather bluntly confessed, I'm honestly lost in admiration for Robinson. He has done splendidly, and I honestly am quite surprised. I did not think much of him as a first lieutenant, but that evidently does not prevent him from being an exceedingly brave man. Now, there were several decorations actually handed out for this action here to rescue the E-15, and a number of people have suggested that it may even have merited a bar to the Victoria Cross for Eric Robinson. That didn't come, however. He was promoted in the field to commander. And just a couple of weeks later, Robinson actually landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula himself. It was the 25th of April, the very first day of the campaign, where Robinson served briefly at Anzac as the naval transport officer. This photograph's taken within the first days of the landings. Both those photographs there, maybe Robinson somewhere on that beach organising those supplies to be landed. He was badly wounded on the 27th, and this actually forced his evacuation away from the Dardanelles itself. After recovering from his wounds, and you can see them there on his naval whites with his arm in a sling on the right-hand side, the now familiar sort of shaped face of his, dear old Eric, he was given command of HMS M21. Now, this was actually intended as a shore bombardment vessel. It was actually equipped, as you can see there, with a rather large 9.2-inch gun that had been taken off of HMS Theseus. The sister ship of HMS Hawke, the very ship that Eric's brother Ernest had lost his life on. It actually supported the Second Battle of Gaza in March 1917, firing both gas and HE shells onto the Ottoman positions. For his command of this vessel, he was awarded the Order of the Nile. The M21 would actually strike a mine just off of the Ostend coast in October 1918, and though it towed to Dover, it sunk, and it still lays just off of West Pier in Dover to this day. By then, however, Kipper had transferred to a very different type of craft, one far more suited to his personality, those of coastal motor boats. Now, these really are boys' own vessels. Look at that. Made by Thornycroft Vesper. They were largely armed with one torpedo and a Lewis gun forward facing, and 55 foot long, the initial ones. They could actually have a speed of 75 knots, so they didn't hang around. These vessels were actually going to play rather a significant role in the Zeebrugge Raid on St. George's Day 1918. For the actual raid itself, Kipper had been overlooked by Roger Keyes due to the nature of his wounds. He did, however, allow Robinson to train many of the coastal motorboat crews that were involved. Now, despite his obvious talent for handling these vessels, one of which was actually commanded by his local MP from Greenwich, a chap called Sir Ian Hamilton Benn, who at Ostend in the same raid was awarded the DSO. By the time the armistice came, Eric had actually not yet used one in anger. He wouldn't have to wait long, however, for in January 1919, when most of the British forces were either on their way back or home celebrating the armistice, he was dispatched in command of 12 coastal motorboats to the Caspian Sea, where the Russian Bolsheviks were posing quite a significant threat to the Royal Navy. Now let's have a look at this, because I probably hazard a guess that not many of us know much about the Caspian Sea. It's certainly not a battlefield that I've managed to visit in my years of guiding. It actually is the world's largest inland body of water, stretching some 1,200 kilometers north to south. To actually reach their deployment area in the Caspian Sea, the coastal motorboats had to be transported to the Black Sea port of Batami. You can see there at the bottom of my screen, held by the British. And then they were taken overland by train to the port of Baku on the edge of the Caspian Sea. Now, their mission whilst there was twofold. Though publicly, the message was they were to support the anti-Bolshevik governments of Armenia, of Azerbaijan, and of Georgia, the real objectives, we think, were firstly to seize Krasnovodsk and the terminal of the Trans-Caspian Railway, and secondly, to prevent the Baku oil fields from falling into either German or into Ottoman control, still very much a concern at this stage in history. Now, after setting up his hospital in Baku, his headquarters in Baku Hospital, the nature of the iced up port of Astrakhan, along with the distance he was from the nearest Bolshevik naval force, actually allowed him a fair few months to plan free from intervention right through to the spring of 1920. More pressing for him at this stage was the Russian naval flotilla that was based at Baku. Since the collapse of Russia, we'd seen a lot of ill discipline had set in, and a number of the British in the theatre were concerned that at any stage the Russian Navy may switch across to the Bolshevik side. The Russian commander himself, Colonel Vorensky, was told to surrender his fleet or face sinking, and Robinson was ordered to escort them out of harbour and to take the surrender. And you can see one of his vessels there on the right of the screen. Despite orders to surrender being read out to each ship in Russian and in English, the deadline passed with no obvious sign of movement on board of the Russian vessels. Robinson then sped his CMB towards the lead ship. He launched a torpedo that ran deep and underneath the stern of the Russian warship. Even today, we're not sure whether this was a deliberate miss by Robinson or actually it was just a chance miss, but either way, it galvanized the Russian crew somewhat, who immediately began to surrender en masse. Now, when the ice port of Astrakhan was open, the time came finally for him to meet this Bolshevik force that were further up the coast inland. Initially, skirmishes prevailed, but the first real action took place on the 21st of May, 1919, when, after a 90-minute engagement, 9 Bolshevik ships were sunk or were blown up. Commander Norris, the chap you see there on the left, who was in charge in the theatre, claimed that they'd been given the enemy a bloody good thumping. Just a day later, however, 2 of the undamaged Bolshevik crewed ships, the Kruger and the Venture, were sighted. Now, this was a real concern because they were both faster and able to outgun the British. Norris this time confessed that the Bolsheviks had got us cold and our number was up. He immediately ordered Kipper Robinson via radio to withdraw. Withdraw was not really a word in Kipper's language. Kipper immediately ignored this and began to deploy his coastal boats, motorboats, directly towards the Bolshevik force. Now, amazingly, the Bolshevik commander, seeing the smoke on the horizon, concluded that he was being drawn into an ambush and an attack, so he turned and he fled. Kipper's bold disregard for orders perhaps had saved the day. Just 5 days later, Kipper again personally led an attack on the remainder of the Bolshevik fleet. These were now holed up in Alexandrovsk harbour. He sunk an armoured barge, and immediately a white flag was spotted over the port, and the deputation came out to surrender to the British. What was now left of the Bolshevik Navy withdrew into the safety of the Volga River Delta and refused to show itself to the British again. Back in London, the chap there that obviously needs no introduction, Winston Churchill, reported an immediate British victory and an immediate withdrawal of all of the British forces. We would now hand over the situation safely to local troops. Now, this rings chillingly true, doesn't it, of recent foreign policy. Whilst the Caspian conflict was far from over, it was now over for the Royal Navy and over for the British. Kipper actually left in September 1919, and by March 1920, just 5 months later, the Bolshevik forces had returned, triumph over the anti-Bolsheviks, and independence from Soviet control would not return to the local area until 1991. For his role in the campaign, however, Kipper was awarded the Order of St. Anne, the OBE, and also promoted to captain. Finally, on returning home that spring, Eric Gascoigne Kipper Robinson War had come to an end, but not his naval career. That would last for another 20 years. By now, his family were growing up somewhat, and he was able to spend a lot more quality time with his 2 sons, Patrick and Tim, and also his daughter, Sheila. He commanded various destroyer squadrons until 1928, when he was reunited with his old adversary, Vice Admiral Tyrwhitt, who you can see there looking a lot older and more distinguished on the left. And as captain of HMS Berwick, He was a heavy cruiser, armed on a heavy cruiser, part of the China Station. Now, this is again another fascinating time in our history, because at this stage on the Berwick, he was working closely with our old Great War allies, the Japanese. He would be based at Hong Kong, or the naval building we see here at Singapore, with a blurry image on the right there. But this briefing period led to another foreign award for Eric. This time he was awarded the Japanese Order of the Sacred Treasure, 3rd class. That's a mouthful, isn't it? There it is on the left. By 1930, however, any relationship with Japan had soured significantly, and Eric once again returned to Blighty. Now, it was during this time he actually served as King's Harbour Master for Devonport. By now, the 50-year-old Kipper was sort of finally placed onto the retirement list and given the rank of Rear Admiral. He was beginning to settle into his retirement in the early 1930s, when just a few years later, his wife Edith tragically passed away. It was by now 1938, however, and any personal grievances that he had, or grieving to do, sorry, would soon to be cut short as the storm clouds once again gathered over Europe. And in August 1939, like many serving and retired naval officers, a letter postmarked Berlin arrived somewhat unannounced throughout the post. On an opening, Kipper discovered a pamphlet that was actually written by Dr. Goebbels, who you see there on the left, entitled The Reply to English Propaganda. Through it, he made various attacks on British imperial history, but the actual pamphlet concluded with a rather chilling paragraph that read, "Your English propaganda tricks are absurd. There was a time when we National Socialists possessed no power, and yet we were able to overcome our political opponents at home. That trained us in the work of propaganda. From 1914 to 1918, you were dealing with a nation that was practically unprepared. The position today is very different. We are now a politically minded nation, and we know what is at stake. Tomfoolery, such as that contained in your letter, can no longer bamboozle us. You can tell those little tales to the Marines, you honest old British Jack Tar." Quite a strange letter, and quite a strange use of language and an understanding. Use words such as tomfoolery and bamboozle, not something you expect to hear from Nazi Germany. Of course, even more chilling, that image on the right there shows the Devonport facility that Kipper had recently retired from, but drawn up as part of a Luftwaffe map showing the various targets that needed to be hit there and in and around Plymouth itself that was so badly damaged in the war. Now, this was obviously intended to almost scaremonger against some of the naval personnel, but like many, Robinson wasn't swayed by this. In fact, all it did was confirm his own views about the growing problems with Germany. And in fact, he'd already volunteered to return to the service. And by the time we get to the outbreak of the war, a month later, we find him once again in naval whites. Only this time, a lot more than naval whites, has he volunteered for a commodore, or to be a commodore as a convoy commander. Now, this was quite a unique role, really, and not one that you hear much about. Largely taken up by recent retired naval officers. The whole idea of having convoy screen to protect merchant vessels was fairly new. But what they did was they'd put a naval member of naval personnel, normally serving in a lower rank than one they held when they were in the Navy themselves, into one of the main merchant vessels in the middle of the convoy. And along with a radio operator, they would be the one that would liaise and communicate with the outlying convoy vessels. And for the first 2 to 3 years of the war, this is how the system worked. And of course, this is often referred to as the happy hunting ground time for the U-boats, who were able to wreak havoc amongst British merchant ships with or without the convoys. It's a very dangerous task indeed. It actually saw Kipper Robinson working on no less than 13 convoys over the next 2 years. Really a most stressful time, not least one convoy itself HX-66 that in August 1940 was attacked by the U-32 with the loss of 3 ships. Eventually, now at 59 years old and suffering from ill health and stress, he was forced to return back to the UK in September 1941 for a recuperation break. And although he was at this stage reunited with his daughter and the birth of his first grandchild, both his sons were by now on active service. In fact, it was just a few months later, there'd be another sad twist of fate for Kipper, when on the 19th of December 1941, he received news that his youngest son, Tim, was lost on board HMS Neptune, along with 763 others of his comrades, after this had struck a minefield between Malta and Tripoli. It was unable to be rescued and eventually struck more mines and sunk. Now, by 1942, here's a couple of images, aren't they, to stir you into intrigue what's going on here. Robinson had recovered enough to rejoin the colours, and he was given the job, which sounds a bit like an outcast posting, but one nevertheless that's fascinating. He took up the role as naval officer in charge of Dundee. Now, Dundee itself was obviously a small naval port at the time, or fairly large naval port, but small by naval standards. More often than ever before, perhaps, this posting tested his character, his personality, and also his diplomacy, as Dundee was the home of a rather intriguing bunch known as the 9th Submarine Flotilla. This was a very unique multinational force made up of crews of submarines from the occupied nations of Poland, Holland, France, and Norway. One Dutch officer actually wrote of his time in this 9th Submarine Flotilla that all those nationalities, they were so different in their beings and needs. The Dutch wanted more potatoes, the French wanted more red wine, the Poles needed love, and the Norwegians, for starters, did not want anything from anybody. One mistake, one wrong decision, and the balance was lost. But this never actually happened. It was during this time that Kipper Robinson actually got to work with General de Gaulle, who was the commander of the Free French forces. It was also during this time that de Gaulle's plane crashed by subterfuge or sabotage, whilst de Gaulle survived the crash himself, and the Germans were blamed. De Gaulle always had his suspicions that it was an inside job, didn't he? However, he got on very well with Robinson. You can see the two of them in that picture on the left. De Gaulle, of course, was the commander of the Free French forces, and it was for his service in this role at Dundee that after the war, Kipper was awarded by the French with both the Légion d'honneur and the Croix de Guerre avec Palms, the citation reading for most valuable services rendered in the common cause for your cooperation with the French Navy. And that would be a lovely place to end this talk, really, wouldn't it? But of course, that's not how Kipper's life was. It was the twists and turns of bravery, of just incredible situations, and every so often we have to see these awful turns of tragedy. And so again, it happened, you know, despite having over 45 years of military service, there'd be one further twist of fate for Kipper Robinson. It was on the 25th of June 1942, a day he was actually looking after one of the Dutch kings who'd flown his own plane into Dundee to inspect the cruise up here and have a meeting with a number of foreign dignitaries, that he received a telegram that his remaining son, his last son Patrick, who was serving on as a navigator in the Halifax bomber, flying out of Yorkshire in 102 Squadron Royal Air Force Bomber Command, had been shot down en route to Germany. His body was actually recovered at sea by the Germans and reburied here in Oldenburg military cemetery. And one wonders if Kipper actually got to travel to Oldenburg and visit the grave of his son. Now, after the war, Kipper finally retired to a place called Langrish in Hampshire. He certainly remained active in the community here, where he was both a church warden and also on the local parish council. He, of course, had lost his brother, his wife, and his 2 sons in his time. So gone through his own fair amount of personal tragedy. And he himself passed away at Haslar Naval Hospital in August of 1965. And in fact, in 1998, the headstone that had fallen into some disrepair was re-cleaned up and rededicated to the one you can see here in the photograph. And I believe his granddaughter attended that service. It was also at the time that the Vengeance was also being commissioned as one of the new submarines, and they took a great interest in the fact that Robinson had served on HMS Vengeance at an early stage in his own career. There's no doubt to my mind, just to conclude, that Eric Kipper Gascoigne Robinson was an extraordinary man that lived in rather extraordinary times, and is certainly one who's a privilege for me to remember whenever I'm visiting the Dardanelles. And Eric, I hope it's not too long before I'm able to get back there this May and traipse back over to see where you led that raiding party. So with that said, I'll say cheers, Kipper, and I shall hand back to Simon.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That's an amazing story. As I say, I'd never knew about him. I'd heard his name, but real boy's own character.
It's an incredible. Well, it's a film script, isn't it? Really,
Absolutely. And you showed the victor there a couple of times. Is he actually commemorated by name in some of these stories, or
in whereabouts? You say
in the comics in Victor?
No, I unfortunately not. There are a few First World War victors over the years that I've managed to pick up, and they are very good. Maybe it's a topic for another webinar, to be fair, because certainly when you look at the Victor comic strips and you read through them, despite them being comics for lads and lasses, of course, historically they've got a lot of integrity. And if I just off the top of my head tell you about one cover story that is about the 2nd Royal Munster Fusiliers in October 1918, crossing the River Selle, led by Lieutenant Colonel Bess Dunkley, being awarded a DSO. And you think it could be a Stand 2 article, but it's in cartoon. So I did once write to them and say, look, do you want to republish these, and we'll bulk it out with a bit of history? So I never got a reply. But maybe we should do that. Victor comic through the ages.
Absolutely. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed that as much as I did. If you want to raise your hands like we normally do, just to thank Clive for the talk. You can see on your own screen, I'm sure, Clive, hundreds of people raising their hands now. A couple of comments, though. Angela, early on, Angela Hall, asked if you'd used the book by Edward Erickson.
Great book. Yeah, very, very good. Very good book. And Edward's written a couple of books actually on the Gallipoli Campaign, and I really like them because he looks at a lot more academically at the structure of brigade command and exactly how it works. And Command Under Fire was an excellent book indeed, well worth getting hold of if you haven't got a copy.
Yeah, well, Angela makes a point. She did the index for the book, apparently.
Well, there you are. Well done, Angela.
And David Muir is just it's a comment, not a question. He says if he acquired the nickname Kipper at school, it was borne out by the fact he had involvement with torpedoes, as they are frequently referred to as Kippers.
Another one that makes perfect sense. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of one of the suggestions is that he smoked so much, he smoked like a kipper. But that I don't really. It's one of these things, isn't it? That could be another viable alternative. Yeah, very good stuff. There is actually a very good blog on Robinson's life that was published in about 1912 online, where you can see a lot more detail on some of the actions that we've gone into, with some good quotes well worth looking up. So you can find him quite on Google. But as yet, I'm not aware of anyone that's actually written a biography of him that's been published.
Right. Well, as you said earlier on, it deserves it, doesn't it? Good grief.
Yeah, incredible man.
Yeah, we're getting comments coming like enthralling, great. Oh,
That's a good one. Peter Newham. I can
right.
see that one coming up.
Right.
Yeah, I can see that. So Peter's saying there that no, you don't sound disparaging at all. Was Robinson considered by the Admiral to be more brawn than brains? Do you know what? There might be something in that. I think we got a few insights into it when you looked at Roger Keyes, who's very, very blunt on matters. He'll tell you as he finds you, and to say that he wasn't impressed with him as a young commander shows that his skills lay elsewhere. The fact that Tyrwhitt and him never really saw eye to eye, and then equally, if you look at his time in the Caspian Sea, where you could argue he disobeyed a direct order. So I think that potentially means that you're not looking at a future Sea Lord or Admiral of the Fleet in Robinson, but you know what, you need people like him, and you need them in campaigns like the Dardanelles, where measured risks needed to be taken if we were going to have any chance of achieving anything out there. So him and Keyes would be a good fit, actually.
Yeah, a couple of comments. No questions because you've done such a great job. No questions needed because it was an excellent talk. It's only a brief question. I won't bring him up on video. Michael Fitzgerald, how well did his face fit in with the conventional naval authorities?
Yeah, he seems to always be pushed out to secondary. He wasn't put on a dreadnought. He wasn't part of the Grand Fleet. He was, he was given a charge of a monitor, as opposed to an actual HMS vessel, effectively a gun platform at various times. But he always tried to make the most of those roles that he was in. I think he did pretty well. I see their kit has asked, how come Hipper had command of a ship just named M61? Well, that's exactly what it was. It was a monitor. The M stands for monitor, and this is effectively an artillery piece that is mounted on a stable platform to activate as a shore battery. It's almost like naval artillery, if you like. So they often didn't name these ships. And see, this one was a 9.2-inch gun, as you can see.
Okay, no webinar would be complete without Gordon, so I've brought Gordon up on video. Gordon, do you want to ask your question?
Please do.
Thank you, Simon. Yes, fantastic, marvellous that, Clive. I enjoyed it enormously. Good. Would a lieutenant commander normally lead such a dangerous run ashore?
I think it was.
Why dressed in naval whites?
I think it was because it was such an early run ashore. There was no protocol down. There was no sort of like, this is what you wear. This is the kit they had. They were on Mediterranean service or Near East service. So it's what they were wearing on day-to-day basis. Even the pictures that we see of him recovering from his wounds is in whites. All the artist depictions of him are in whites. I don't, unlike the Marines that may well have been wearing serge khaki and uniforms, Robinson himself was just in his whites, was his working dress. That's what he went with. But quite incredible. He would have stood out, wouldn't he?
He would have been like a sore thumb, wouldn't he? Am I right in thinking that there were four other VCs awarded during that particular action?
I'm not sure during that raid. There certainly are two various sort of naval escapades in and around prior to the landings.
Yes,
on the 25th of
around
April.
The area, the Dardanelles.
And I mean, if you look at the Gallipoli Association, for instance, on their actual logo crest has the dates, November 1914 to January 1916, because the campaign itself did not start with the landings on the 25th of April. Actually start when we arrived, when we chased the Gobe and the Breslau into the Dardanelles, and we occupied the outer forts and almost hold them up, refusing them to leave. That's when the campaign starts. So there are a number of actions that predate the landings, definitely.
Right, yeah. And it's just that I looked him up in the symbols of courage.
Yeah.
And it mentions other VCs.
Yeah, Holbrook is the interesting one. You might have seen Holbrook was the submarine captain, and he The interesting story about him, it's a good story of how, she's downstairs so she can't hear me, how I hoodwinked my wife when we went on a tour to see relatives in Australia, because I said, wouldn't it be a good idea, instead of every year we go and we fly from Sydney up to the Gold Coast, why don't we have some family time and we'll drive it? It's only, what, 1,600 miles? And we'll pick out some nice villages along the way. And I just stuck my, I said, why don't we stop there? That sounds nice, Holbrook, because I knew that it was, I think it was called something like Little Germany, or it had certainly a Germanic name. And after Holbrook was awarded his VC, the local population said, no, we are going to change the name to Holbrook in honour. And of course, the first Victoria Cross Memorial, my wife said, that's unusual, isn't it? And then when we realised we'd been to, it was like Submarine Disneyland, the game was up. I think. I didn't get to choose any of the next destinations.
Right. Thank you for that, Clive. Thank you.
No, thank you, Gordon.
Thanks, Gordon. Bye. Thank you. John Casey.
Oh, my old friend John.
Hi, Clive. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, mate.
I was intrigued by the idea that he disobeyed orders in the Caspian.
Mm.
And did the Navy's regulations at the time have any equivalent field service regulations that enabled the men on the spot to depart from orders if the circumstances warranted it?
I don't think there was any, I'm not aware of any form of mission command as such that they would have had at the time. I certainly wouldn't. I mean, if there had been at Gallipoli, I mean, this is 1918, so it's a really good question. The answer is I don't know. And the reason I say I'm not sure they did, because if there was mission command or a time when the officer on the scene can disobey orders, and I was Roger Keyes, I probably would have launched, or I would have gone back to as chief of staff and told Rubeck on the 19th of March, what time do we start in the morning? As opposed to de Rubeck, if you know the story, sent Keyes off to rescue an ailing ship just at the time when they were planning what they were going to do the next day. And I've always had my suspicions that's because de Rubeck knew that if Keyes was in the room, he would have made a stronger case for the argument to let's give it one more day on the 19th. So it was almost like, let's remove the problem and give him a secondary task. I'm still not sure why you'd send your chief of staff to rescue an ailing ship at a time like that. But
my impression is that the Navy got very sort of hidebound in the later Victorian period, and probably Nelson wouldn't have been very much in favour with his.
No. And how often, John, do you see these references? And there was one in that Times article where they try and link the Royal Navy of 1914 back to Trafalgar, back to Nelson, back to those old days. You know, it's certainly. They like to make the links between the Navy of old and the Navy of the First World War. But yeah, I'm not sure actually. It'd be interesting to find out.
Yeah. Okay. Cheers, Clive.
No, thank you.
Thank you very much, Trevor.
Hi, Clive. Great talk. Thank you very much.
That's okay.
I just wonder if you come across with the Boxer Rebellion, the rather bizarre connection that the future President Herbert Hoover was there with his wife Lou. As a mining engineer, he of course did a lot of relief work for civilians in Belgium during World War I.
Yeah.
The bit I really love is that Lou Hoover, being a rooting-tooting girl from the Midwest, took her stint in guard duty in the cantonment when they were surrounded by the Boxers. Patrol with a Mauser pistol. So if you ever come across that with the your research?
No, I'm guessing this must have been back in Beijing. They must have made it back as far as the embassy or something, and were holed up in the embassy, or
I think
it was
something like that. Yeah, and they were holed up, I think, for quite a long time, in weeks, I think it was.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, look, just that brief period of looking into it for this talk, it did make me want to kind of go out there and see what's left of those places, and just to study coalition warfare at its origins like that, because. There were, as you know, US Marines were involved. They sent the US units there as well, and being relieved by Cossacks and all that sort of stuff would have been quite incredible. Oh, fascinating. I'll have to look her up. Good old Lou.
Thank you again, Clive.
No, my pleasure.
Thanks, Trevor. David.
Thank you very much, Clive, and thank you for your thoughts on my earlier comment.
That's right.
What I thought was that you say that Robinson seems to have been something of shall we say, a bit of a loose cannon in some ways. And it just reminded me of I worked with somebody who had served under John Kerrans, who later commanded HMS Amethyst in the Yangtze.
Wow, okay. Yeah.
And I remember him saying that Kerrans would more or less go out of his way to seek a fight. And I wonder just how many naval officers are in this category.
Yeah, I do wonder. I don't know if you remember going back to earlier Western Front Association days, but our dear old friend Tony Spagnoli, who served in the sort of China up towards the not the Yangtze, but certainly sailed up the Yangtze at various times on HMS Belfast. Used to talk about his time out there and some of his commanders being a little bit not risk averse, shall I say. They didn't mind going for it. So maybe it's a naval thing. I mean, I could say I just think that Kipper just shows normal Southeast London behaviour, to be fair. So maybe it's more to him being a Herbert, even if he had a nicer address than me. I'm very proud of him anyway, as a local chap, and I do like that splash of character in his that splash of colour in his character. But yeah, I think loose cannon's not a bad description.
Thanks, David. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
We've no more questions at the moment, but you've probably seen, Clive, that Deborah Fisher says, could you work up a 37-minute presentation on 37?
There are two areas of the battlefields that I know of that I'll mention just briefly. One is Blue Beach at Puis on the Dieppe Raid, and the other one would be Rickerval Bridge on the Hindenburg Line, where it takes longer to guide those actions than the actions actually took.
Yeah.
And I defy people to do it in the same time. So those things are out there. So I'm not sure. Yeah, that'd be an interesting thing. I'd like to know more about it anyway.
Okay, well, thanks very much indeed. If you'd like to raise your hands again, as we always do. I want to thank Clive very much for a fascinating talk tonight. First one of the new year. Just to tell you that we've got an action-packed January coming up. So certainly in January, probably going into February, we've got two events every week. Every Monday night, we've got a webinar, and every Thursday night, there's something happening. So on this coming Thursday, we've got a return of the big quiz, which was quite popular last year. Next Monday, we've got another webinar, which sees Bill Stewart coming back, looking at the official Canadian history of events on the 2nd of September 1918 and questioning the accuracy of that official history. And then on the Thursday, that's Thursday of next week, we're back with our third virtual battlefield tour, looking at Beaumont-Hamel in 1916.
That's me.
I was just going to say, Clive, is that you again?
Yeah, it is.
Not the 1st of July. You're looking at November, I think, aren't you? The 51st Highland Division.
51st Highland Division, yeah.
So we'll have Clive back in about 10 days, by which time I hope to be out of isolation. And but all the details, you probably had them on an email from Jill Stewart, but they're all on the website. So every Monday and every Thursday throughout January. So I think that's it. Thank Clive once again. See you in about a week and a half, perhaps, on Thursday night.
Yeah.
And to wish you all a very happy and a very safe New Year.
Thanks, you. Thanks, Simon. Thank you.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières.